The Nightclub Shootout, Manchester 2019. It was just after midnight when the music inside the popular city center nightclub cut short, not because the DJ stopped, but because someone outside pulled a trigger. Screams erupted as shots rang out on the street. Clubgoers ducked, staff fled, and police flooded the scene within minutes. Several men were injured, one critically. Shell casings littered the pavement. CCTV later captured the gunman running off, hood up, weapon in hand. It wasn't a random act of violence. This was a warning, or perhaps a message. Either way, law enforcement knew exactly who to look at: the Cheetham Hill Gang. To the public, the gang was just another name in Manchester's long list of criminal groups. But to the police and rival crews across the city, Cheetham Hill, known on the streets as the Hillbillies, were a problem with history. This wasn't their first shooting, and it wouldn't be their last. For over 4 decades, the Cheetham Hill Gang has dominated drug routes, extorted businesses, and waged bloody wars against rival gangs across Greater Manchester. Their legacy is one of violence, intimidation, and survival, adapting from street-level thuggery in the 1980s to modern-day organized crime, complete with encrypted phones, designer clothes, and social media bravado. What happened outside that club in 2019 was just one chapter in a story that began long ago, on the streets of North Manchester. And it's a story that, even now, still isn't finished. The origins, from turf to territory. To understand the Cheetham Hill Gang, or the Hillbillies as they came to be known, you have to go back to 1980s Manchester, a city fractured by poverty, racial tension, and a rising tide of gang culture. The Cheetham Hill area, just north of the city center, was a dense urban patchwork of estates, corner shops, and decaying industrial sites. It was home to working-class families, immigrant communities, and, increasingly, young men with few options and plenty of anger. In this environment, the first wave of street crews began to form, loosely organized groups that fought over territory, respect, and opportunity. Petty theft turned into armed robbery. Turf wars became shootings. What started as protection rackets around local shops grew into something far more lucrative: control over drugs, clubs, and nightlife. By the late 1980s, the Cheetham Hill Gang had taken shape. Their name came not from formal branding, but from the simple fact that they controlled Cheetham Hill. It was their ground, and outsiders weren't welcome. While early members were often young and unorganized, violence quickly became their trademark. As Manchester became a hotspot for heroin and later crack cocaine, the gang moved into drug distribution, at first small scale, then expanding through networks across Greater Manchester. Cheetham Hill wasn't alone. At the same time, other gangs were rising in Moss Side, Longsight, and Hume, including rivals like Doddington, Pepperhill, and later the notorious Gooch Close gang. But Cheetham stood out for its brutal enforcement. They didn't just sell drugs. They controlled corners, bullied competitors, and sent clear warnings to anyone who stepped out of line. The gang operated with a mix of local loyalty and calculated violence, and as the years passed, their influence spread. From a handful of young men with bricks and bats, the Cheetham Hill Gang evolved into a feared criminal network, one that would go on to fight some of the deadliest gang wars in Manchester's history. Guns, drugs, and power. By the early 1990s, the Cheetham Hill Gang had moved far beyond street brawls and petty crime. They were now a fully operational criminal syndicate, violent, well-connected, and deeply embedded in Manchester's illegal economy. Their primary currency was drugs. The gang controlled key parts of the city's heroin and crack cocaine supply. They sourced product through European contacts and smuggled it into the UK via couriers, vehicles, and port links, often using front businesses as a cover. Once inside the country, the drugs were broken down and distributed to local dealers operating under hillbilly protection. But with drugs came money, and with money came the need to enforce power. That's where the guns came in. Firearms became commonplace within the gang's upper ranks. Members armed themselves with handguns, sawn-off shotguns, and later converted automatic weapons. The purpose wasn't just defense, it was dominance. Witnesses were threatened, debtors were shot at, rivals were hunted. The Hillbillies didn't negotiate, They eliminated problems, and their reach wasn't limited to the streets. The gang infiltrated Manchester's nightlife economy, offering security services to clubs and bars. In reality, this was little more than coercive racketeering. Business owners either paid for protection or risked violence, property damage, or worse. Kidnappings also became part of the Hillbillies' arsenal, used as both a tactic of fear and a tool for leverage. Enemies were abducted, sometimes tortured, sometimes released, and sometimes disappeared altogether. As police pressure grew, the gang adapted. They stopped dressing the part, ditching tracksuits for suits, burner phones for encrypted lines. But the message stayed the same. Cheetham Hill controlled Cheetham Hill, and anyone who challenged that rule bled for it. With over 100 members by the early 2000s, some deeply loyal, others operating in cells, the gang had transformed into a criminal machine. And then came the bloodiest phase of their reign, the turf wars. The feuds. War with Moss Side. In the world of gangland Manchester, few rivalries have been as violent, or as long-lasting, as the one between Cheetham Hill and the gangs of Moss Side. The feud began in the late 1980s and intensified through the 1990s and 2000s, as control over drug markets, club security, and territorial dominance turned Manchester's inner-city streets into a war zone. On one side stood Cheetham Hill, aggressive, established, and increasingly structured. On the other stood the gangs of Moss Side, including the Doddington crew, the Pepperhill mob, and eventually the Gooch Close gang, all equally ruthless and determined. The city's layout only made things worse. Moss Side and Cheetham Hill were separated by just a few miles, a short drive, or a dangerous walk, depending on who you were and what you were wearing. Turf could change in a single street. The wrong postcode could get you shot. Over the years, this rivalry produced dozens of shootings, stabbings, arson attacks, and murders. One of the most infamous flashpoints came when a Cheetham Hill-linked crew clashed with Moss Side members in a crowded city nightclub, leading to a shootout that sent civilians scrambling for cover. In other incidents, cars were sprayed with bullets in broad daylight. Shops were burned. Homes of family members were targeted in retaliations. Sometimes the victims weren't even gang members, just people in the wrong place at the wrong time. One Moss Side figure was quoted as saying, "We weren't at war with Cheetham, we were surviving Cheetham." At the height of the conflict, Greater Manchester Police created dedicated gang units just to contain the violence. They conducted raids, seized weapons, and monitored funeral services and rap videos for signs of brewing retaliation. But for every arrest, another name filled the gap. The violence was self-sustaining. Every shooting demanded a response. Every death required a score to be settled. The feud wasn't just about drugs or power anymore. It became generational. Young men born into these postcodes inherited hatred, loyalty, and trauma. Some had fathers or older brothers who had been killed by rival crews. For them, the war was personal. To this day, echoes of the feud still linger in Manchester's streets. And while the names and faces may change, the story remains the same. Cheetham Hill versus Moss Side, a fight for control, survival, and legacy. Cheetham in the 2000s, chaos and control. As the new millennium rolled in, the Cheetham Hill Gang faced a rapidly changing world. New surveillance technologies, tougher sentencing laws, and growing police pressure. But rather than fall apart, the gang adapted and in many ways tightened its grip on Manchester's underworld. By the 2000s, the Hillbillies had become deeply embedded in the city's nightlife scene. Bars, clubs, and music venues across Manchester became both their playground and their battleground. They provided security to certain establishments, not to keep violence out, but to keep competitors out. Rival dealers and promoters were intimidated, beaten, or worse. The gang began investing in front businesses, car washes, shisha lounges, gyms. These locations became hubs for laundering drug money, coordinating deals, and recruiting new members. Often teenagers who were promised fast cash, designer clothes, and protection. Meanwhile, the streets of Cheetham Hill itself remained under their control. Locals knew when to look the other way. Witnesses stayed silent. Police patrols were seen as temporary disruptions. Nothing more. The gang's income sources diversified. Cocaine and heroin remained core. Cannabis farms popped up in rented properties. Stolen cars were used for robberies, chopped for parts, or sold abroad. Human trafficking, particularly in the form of forced prostitution, became a quiet but profitable expansion. Despite internal fractures and periodic violence, a loose hierarchy kept things running. Older members enforced rules, collected money, and made high-level decisions. Younger foot soldiers handled street dealing and enforcement. Violators were dealt with harshly. But chaos was never far behind. Infighting over money, status, and respect erupted into violence. Splinter groups formed. Younger members, eager to prove themselves, committed reckless acts, drive-by shootings, ambushes, kidnappings, often attracting unwanted heat from law enforcement. Still, the core of the gang endured. It became less visible but more dangerous, operating through encrypted phones, using legal fronts, and keeping its leadership shielded behind layers of street soldiers. Cheetham Hill was no longer just a gang. It was a network, a brand, and, for many in North Manchester, a way of life. Police pressure and crackdowns. By the late 2000s and into the 2010s, Greater Manchester Police, ENGMP, and the National Crime Agency, NCA, had come to see the Cheetham Hill Gang not just as a local threat, but as a long-term organized criminal enterprise. The gang had survived decades of arrests, surveillance, and rivalries. But with the rise of new tools, including EncroChat, advanced forensic tracking, and facial recognition, law enforcement finally had ways to break through the gang's protective layers. Operation after operation was launched. Armed raids targeted stash houses and trap flats. Surveillance teams followed mid-level runners. Hidden cameras monitored meeting points across Cheetham Hill, Blackley, and Pepperhill. In one major crackdown, police seized large quantities of heroin, cocaine, cash, and multiple firearms, some of which were linked to unsolved shootings across Manchester. Dozens of gang members were arrested, with many handed prison sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. And yet, the gang remained. For every lieutenant taken off the street, another young prospect stepped up. The fluid structure of Cheetham Hill made it hard to kill. There were no official ranks, no formal meetings, just respect, reputation, and fear. Law enforcement also faced a wall of silence from the community. Intimidation of witnesses was common. Some locals believed police couldn't protect them from retaliation. Others simply didn't trust the system. One officer described it bluntly: "They don't have a headquarters. They have a postcode and 100 loyal soldiers." Even encrypted messaging didn't guarantee protection for the gang. The 2020 EncroChat leaks exposed communications between several Cheetham-linked figures discussing drug shipments, firearms deals, and turf threats. Arrests followed, but the core infrastructure held. The gang's persistence forced law enforcement to shift focus, from chasing individuals to targeting financial networks, disrupting money laundering routes and property assets. But even that proved slow and difficult. After 40 years of survival, the Cheetham Hill Gang had learned one rule: when under pressure, go quiet, go deeper, and wait. New faces. Legacy of the Hillbillies. By the 2000s, many of the original Hillbillies were either dead, serving long prison sentences, or living in quiet retirement off dirty money. But the gang never disappeared. It simply evolved. A new generation had stepped in to fill the void. Younger, flashier, and more connected to social media than the streets, these recruits grew up idolizing the gang's legacy. Some were nephews or sons of former members. Others were outsiders desperate to wear the badge of Cheetham Hill. The modern face of the gang became harder to define. While some still operated in the shadows, dealing drugs, enforcing debts, and trafficking women, others posed online in designer gear, filming rap videos with masked faces and expensive cars. They flaunted wealth, referenced postcode rivalries, and used TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat to build reputations. But beneath the filters and music, the core business remained the same: drugs, cocaine, cannabis, and increasingly, pills and ketamine. Weapons, smuggled, rented, and recycled across Manchester. Exploitation, grooming teens, running county lines, forcing silence. Loyalty, demanded, tested, and punished if broken. The gang still had reach. Some of its members were seen mingling with UK rap and drill artists, using music both as a front and as a form of coded communication. Others were tied to violent flare-ups in Manchester city centre, brawls outside clubs, drive-by threats, stabbings over territory. Law enforcement continued to crack down, but with new faces constantly rising, the cycle seemed endless. And for many teens growing up in Cheetham Hill, with poverty, no prospects, and pressure on every corner, joining the gang wasn't rebellion, it was survival. The Hillbillies were no longer just a gang. They were a brand, a legacy, a local myth made real, and they were still in business. A gang that wouldn't die. The Cheetham Hill Gang, known on the streets as the Hillbillies, has survived 4 decades of gang wars, police operations, internal feuds, and generational change. Few criminal groups in the UK can claim such longevity, and even fewer can match their brutality, adaptability, and resilience. From the crack-flooded streets of 1980s Manchester to encrypted phones and viral rap videos of the 2020s, the gang has constantly evolved with its environment. It has shifted from street-level turf battles to transnational drug supply, from machetes to machine pistols, from alley whispers to public social media threats. What makes Cheetham Hill unique isn't just its violence, it's the way the gang has embedded itself into the fabric of a community. For some in North Manchester, the gang represents danger. For others, protection. For many young men, it offers a twisted form of identity, a place to belong when the world offers little else. And yet, after so many years, the story remains unfinished. Police continue to raid, prosecute, and investigate. Families continue to grieve lost sons. Businesses continue to pay quiet security fees. And young men continue to pick up where the last left off, chasing the same dream of power, money, and street fame. The Cheetham Hill Gang isn't just still alive, it refuses to die.